Welcome to Court and Crime with Loni Coombs, where we'll be digging deep into the biggest courtroom dramas, true crime stories, legal news, and compelling cold cases. With my 2 decades of courtroom experience as a criminal prosecutor, as well as my years as a broadcast journalist and legal analyst, I'm going to peel back the layers for you as we do our daily deep dive together. All right, today, big news out of Manhattan. After 35 days in court, 12 jurors, 8 men and 4 women, are now deliberating the fate of rapper and entertainment mogul Sean Diddy Combs. Now, this is a federal criminal trial. He's facing 5 counts: racketeering conspiracy, or RICO, 2 counts of sex trafficking, and 2 counts of transportation for the purpose of prostitution. Now, he faces some serious prison time if convicted, a potential life sentence on the RICO charge. Okay, let's talk about this jury for a moment. 8 men, 4 women who will decide what the facts really are and how the law applies here. Now, their ages range from 30 to 74 years old, and all of them have a college or advanced degree. And already there appear to be some issues arising in that jury room. A note came out to the judge soon after they started their deliberations this morning saying, "We have a juror, number 25, they called him out. We are concerned cannot follow your Honor's instructions. May you please intervene?" Well, after consulting the attorneys, the judge responded with a note of his own. He said, "I received your note. I remind every juror of their duty to deliberate and their obligation to follow my instruction on the law. With that instruction in mind, please continue deliberating." Now, these jurors have listened to over 6 weeks of testimony, very graphic details, including videos of alleged drug-fueled sexual encounters with male escorts, physical violence, and emotional coercion. They also saw texts and heard voice notes revealing very complex relationships between Combs and the alleged victims here, Cassie Ventura and a woman using the pseudonym Jane. Many of the facts weren't actually in dispute, but how they were being interpreted were. The prosecution said this was a criminal enterprise run by Combs to facilitate and cover up these coerced sexual encounters, and that the women involved were forced or coerced into these relationships. Now, on the other hand, the defense has argued that these were consenting adults, all choosing this lifestyle, and that the government shouldn't put crime scene tape up around your bedroom, saying that this whole prosecution is an overreach. Let's discuss all of this with 2 attorneys who have spent many years in the courtroom. Nima Rahmani is a former federal prosecutor and the president of West Coast Trial Lawyers. He is responsible for putting more than 1,000 criminal defendants in prison. And Eric Faddis, he's also a former federal prosecutor who now does both criminal and civil litigation. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. I really appreciate the fact that you have this experience as a federal prosecutor, so you have been in court on cases like this. Nima, let me start with you first. As trial attorneys, we have experienced just how crucial those closing arguments can be, right? Now, here there were 2 very different styles of lawyering in the closings. The prosecution was very meticulous. They had a detailed PowerPoint to go through the charges and explain the law. But meanwhile, the defense came out with a very dramatic narrative telling a story. How would you rate both sides here?
You know, we started with Christy Slavik's opening argument, and you're right, Lonnie. It was a little dry. She was methodical. She was going through each of the offenses and the elements. And then, of course, you had Mark Agnifilo, right? One of the most experienced criminal defense attorneys in New York, maybe the country. And he had a much more emotional style. And he was in some ways mocking the government's prosecution, like you said, and said, wow, look at these raids in Los Angeles and Miami. Look at all this baby oil and lube that's taken off the street. Look how safe we are now. Really flippant. So then you have Maureen Comey, the assistant U.S. attorney who delivered the government's rebuttal. A little bit more emotional. I liked her style a little bit more, but really this is style over substance. Hopefully after 2 months, the jurors aren't basing their decisions on the closing arguments. But if you ask me, I tend to like that emotional style a little bit more. So even though I'm very pro-prosecution, I have to agree with the way Agnifilo handled his closing, if I had to choose between the 2.
Well, after so many days in court, shaking it up a little bit, getting their attention is always a good thing. But Eric, when you're in front of a jury, credibility is key, right? The credibility of the witnesses and the credibility of the attorneys. There were a couple of arguments that defense attorney Mark Agnifilo made in his closing that raised a few eyebrows. So one was when he was talking about the payments made to the male escorts, and he was saying that Combs was paying for their time rather than for sex. And the second one, I think, upset a lot of people, actually, was he described the Combs' relationship with Cassie Ventura. You know, we talked about how it was violent and abusive. They admitted to all of that on the video. But then he called it a, quote, a great modern love story. Do you think that those arguments worked, or do you think he was pushing it too far and perhaps hurt his own credibility in saying those things?
You know, as an attorney, you can absolutely overplay your hand, and you got to be careful about that because, Loni, as you mentioned, there are 4 women on the jury, and so some of these arguments that he was making, in addition to the ones you mentioned, he also, made an argument that was essentially that the survivors were in line with women empowerment, and they had agency, and they wanted to do this, and God bless them, and good for them, and I'm just not sure that struck the right tone with this jury who is deliberating now on a sex trafficking charge, a very serious charge. And so you've got to be careful about, playing into stereotypes and tropes that these individuals in that jury room have likely experienced either themselves or know folks who have experienced those. It could offend them. It could insult them. And so, yes, you can damage your own credibility. And the jury starts to think, gosh, this guy's trying to sell me this, which is bogus. What else is he trying to sell me?
Yeah, and that personal experience of the jurors really does come into play, right, in that deliberation room. Nima, the prosecutors argued a key point in closing here that I think many people were missing before that. They explained that for the sex trafficking charges, you only need to find one incident, right, one incident of force, fraud, or coercion. Just one time where all those elements were met, rather than looking at the entire relationship between Combs and these women being forced or coerced. When there's a long-term relationship like these 2 women had here, there's ups and downs in the relationship. Do you think it actually makes it harder for the prosecution to get them to focus on just that one incident and find them guilty on that one incident?
Loni, absolutely. And again, I believe these women were trafficked. But one of the questions that jurors in these types of cases have is, well, if you're abused, if you were assaulted, why did you stay with your abuser? And we saw this argument work with some success recently in the Harvey Weinstein case. Here's someone who's been convicted of sexual assault twice. The whole Me Too movement started because of him. And during the retrial there in New York, 3 victims continued to have personal and professional relationships with Weinstein, and the jurors ultimately acquitted on one, deadlocked on a second, and only convicted on a third. So when you have emails and text messages from Cassie, words of affirmation showing how much she loved the freak offs and wanted to freak off again and get freaky, and you had Mia, who had some inconsistent statements, and Jane, who her text messages were better, but, seemingly she would acquiesce and she asked Combs for money, maybe look like somewhat of a transactional relationship. It does give the defense something to work with here. And again, the reason these cases are hard is, like you said, jurors, they bring their preconceived notions into that jury deliberation room. And when you're talking about really contentious things like sexual assault and Me Too, it's hard to get 12 out of 12 jurors. I personally, again, believe that they were sex trafficked, but these are very difficult charges given some of the evidence that came in that did support the defense. And frankly, that's why they went from having a 2-week-long case in chief to 2 days and ultimately 30 minutes. They felt confident that they'd raised reasonable doubt during their cross-examination of these witnesses.
Yeah, really good points. And Eric, I want to follow up with you on this. We can talk about the law all day long, but the big elephant in the room might be just how we as a society, right, view sexual abuse in a relationship. And I think we're at a place with the Me Too movement where, the pendulum is swinging back from the extreme position where it was like believe all victims to recognizing that due process is still very important in the whole process. This case, the whole thing is really based on these sexual relationships, whether they were consensual or coerced. Do you think because of that, Eric, it makes it more difficult for the jury to really work through all those issues together?
I do, in part because, like Nima said, these folks have their own experiences, their own perspectives, their own opinions about these issues, and then you sort of bring into that the social forces at play. Me Too had a ton of momentum in 2017, and that would have been a more favorable time for the prosecution to try this case, but it came about now, and now, like you said, there's been a little bit more of a balancing out of some of of those, some might say more extreme iterations of Me Too. And so you have the jurors back there, and they're thinking about what is the law. How does the law define consent? But they're also thinking about, like, in their personal lives and just what they've seen in the media and in the world. What does consent look like? And what are other considerations that might come into play? Like Nima said, even though it's not written into the letter of the law, whether a person stayed with their abuser, even though the jurors are not told to consider that, they might consider it. They might consider other factors like accepting payments and that kind of thing. And so it becomes a really prickly situation back there, especially when you have a number of folks with diverse backgrounds and viewpoints and positions. And to try to come together and get 12 people to agree on anything is difficult, let alone these complex charges on a national stage with, like, the highest stakes there are.
Yeah, I used to always say every verdict was just amazing to me because, like you said, trying to get 12 people to agree on what to order for lunch, much less what the verdict's going to be in a criminal case, it's very hard to do. Eric, this is a really interesting, Nima, it's a really interesting jury here. You've got 8 men, 4 women, all with college degrees, and so, some of them advanced degrees. That isn't very common. Usually you have more of a variety in a jury, and these charges here are fairly complex. How do you think that the makeup of the jury will play here with these charges?
Lonnie, that's absolutely right. I can't recall an instance where I've had a jury, and I've been doing this for more than 2 decades, that every single one has a college degree. Not common. Really just goes to show the caliber of folks that work in the Southern District in New York and live there as well. So, I think it's going to matter, but ultimately, sometimes you don't want people that are going to be all leaders, right? Because you need someone that's going to captain the ship. And especially if you're the prosecution, you want some people that are just going to go along, right? If everyone is highly educated, strong-willed, and I'm not saying that there's necessarily a correlation between education and wanting to be a leader, but right, already you have someone in juror number 25, he's a veterinarian, right? Apparently, he wants to sort of march to the beat of his own drum. And that's a problem if you're the prosecution. It's great for the defense because obviously if you get a holdout juror or 2 or 3, that's a huge win. So you got to be careful for the prosecution to have a lot of strong-minded jurors because, again, then you can have factions, and that's how you may, especially in a challenging case like this, end up with a deadlocked jury and a mistrial.
Yeah, and everybody would hate that right after all these weeks of trial. Eric, the prosecutor, she ended her rebuttal closing argument by saying this, quote, the defendant is not a god, he's a person. And in this courtroom, he stands equal before the law. Now, the question is, does that speak to the jury, do you think, or do we sort of all hold celebrities to a different standard? Do we give them concessions for bad behavior, right? Oh, they're just acting like every other celebrity. I guess to put it another way is if these types of sexual allegations, these freak-offs, were charged against just, Joe Schmo rather than a famous music icon, do you think there would be a different reaction to this case?
I think it's an important question, and because we've seen historically, especially in America, folks who are well situated and have resources and have fame and influence, they tend to not get the same consequences that other folks get. And so I think the prosecutor is really driving home that theme that, hey, look, nobody is above the law. Diddy is not a god. He's not a king. He's subject to the law just like anybody else is. He doesn't get to do this kind of stuff, just as anybody on the street wouldn't get to do this kind of stuff, assuming the allegations are true. And so I think it was really important for the prosecutor to drive home that idea that hey, he is not exalted on some kind of throne such that he can mistreat and perpetrate crimes against folks. So I think it was important for her to highlight, would it be different if there was another person, just like a Joe Schmo, charged with this? I don't know that any Joe Schmoes would be in the situation under these circumstances to be able to pull off something like this, allegedly. And so we really kind of see these sort of things with folks who are in higher echelons of society, fame, wealth, what have you.
Yeah, that's a great point. Eric, you're also a civil litigator, so we know that there are many civil cases pending against Combs. What do you see happening there?
Yikes. There are just so many that he is going to have to contend with after this. In the event that he somehow prevails here in some fashion and avoids prison time, he has case upon case upon case for millions upon millions upon millions that he's looking at. And so, the outcome of this case could have some bearing on how those cases turn out. It could be a shift in momentum. If he prevails or is only convicted on the least serious counts, the interstate transportation of prostitution, then perhaps the folks on the civil side start to think twice about how provable the case is, about sort of the societal viewpoint regarding this case and how that could affect their civil case. And so we could really see a change in how those things play out. Alternatively, if he is convicted of something serious and sentenced to prison, there becomes a collectability issue with these civil cases. There already is a collectability issue, but for the plaintiffs to be able to actually recover money from this person if he's in prison for the rest of his life, that makes it that much harder.
All right, so between you two have many years of experience here. I'm not going to ask you to speculate what the jury is going to decide here, but you, based on your experience and what you've heard from this trial, how do you think that how the prosecution proved their case? What do you think the breakdown will be on the counts? Let's start with you, Nima, first.
I'm not shy to make my prediction. First of all, I am concerned about juror 25 and potential jury nullification, him being a stealth juror. We'll see if he gets his act together and starts deliberating. So far, good news after Judge Subramanian sent that no back. But assuming he deliberates, this is my prediction. I think that the prosecution has proven its case on all counts, but this is how I think the jury is going to come out. And I agree with Eric, of course. The most readily provable charge is the Mann Act, that interstate prostitution. I think that's a gimme. And if that's all the government gets, that is a loss, because this will be the most expensive prostitution trial in American history. So I'm going to say counts 2 and 3 guilty, the Mann Act. I think the government gets a guilty verdict on racketeering. And the reason I think that is because you can get to racketeering through bribery, the $100,000 payment for the video, get there through extortion, shaking down Regina Ventura, Cassie's mom, for $20,000, get there through prostitution. We talked about it. Drug distribution, plenty of evidence of that. Forced labor, get there through obstruction, witness tampering. So I think the government gets a conviction on racketeering. I have concerns about sex trafficking because of the testimony and messages that came out, the stipulations. So I think the jurors either hang or we get a not guilty on sex trafficking. Still, with the racketeering conviction, I think that's a win for the government at the end of the day, even though it's a mixed verdict. If for some reason, again, they only get the Mann Act, I think that'll be a significant loss. But so far, I think racketeering, guilty, prostitution, guilty. In my prediction, he's going to get 10 to 20 years in federal prison as a result.
Interesting, Nima, because a lot of people keep saying that the RICO charge is the hardest one to get, and a lot of people don't think they'll get a conviction on that. But that is the one that has the life possibility, right? Maximum. So that's the most serious one, really, for him as far as those are concerned. Eric, okay, your predictions here.
Yeah, very fair analysis. I respectfully disagree on a few points. So on one point on which I agree is the interstate prostitution. That's pretty darn easy. You have these sex workers whom you're transporting into the jurisdiction for the purpose that everyone knows. It's obvious. It's not that they were going to do some hangout and go to coffee or something. So I think those are slam dunks. However, on the RICO charge, I think there are some problems there. One is that, RICO contemplates a criminal enterprise. It contemplates affiliates, co-conspirators, people who are in agreement to do crime together. We didn't see any co-conspirators charged, which I thought was a misstep by the prosecution. And in fact, the prosecution didn't even call the two main co-conspirators, KK and D-Rock. And so I think the jury is left wondering, hey, what about these folks? And how is this really a criminal enterprise if there's only one dude who's the criminal? And then also on the sex trafficking count, I think that one's going to be difficult, could go either way. But there has been a lot of conflicting testimony and conflicting text messages from Cassie and Jane. Doesn't mean that they weren't aggrieved in some fashion. But, they both mentioned, I didn't feel like I had a choice. That's regrettable and problematic, but that is not sufficient to prove sex trafficking. Government has to prove that Diddy knew that he was forcing them to do this against their wills, and did so anyway. And there has to be a connection between the Sex Act and it being a product of forced fraud or coercion. There wasn't any time that I'm aware of, except for one possible interaction with Jane, in which the alleged victim says, hey, I don't want to do this. And then Diddy says, hey, you got to do it, or else I'm going to beat you up or ruin your career or take all your money. And that one interaction is, I think, disputable. So for those reasons, I think it's going to be not guilty RICO, not guilty sex trafficking, guilty interstate prostitution.
Fascinating analysis. I do agree with you. I think the prosecution not calling KK or D-Rock was a big omission. Everybody kind of noticed there at the very end of the case. Eric Vadas, Nima Rahmani, thank you so much for your very valuable insight and your years of experience here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Loni. Talk soon.